Thank you all for coming tonight. It's very good to see all of you here tonight. I'm Woody Register. I'm the director of the Robeson Project here at Sewanee, and it's my pleasure to be able to introduce tonight's speakers. So the Robeson Project, in case you don't know, here at the University of the South was launched in 2017. It's a 6-year project, at least in this phase, that began by investigating the university's historical entanglements with slavery and slavery's legacies. So the project's name, though, memorializes the late Professor Houston Bryan Roberson, who came to Sewanee in 1997, and he was the first tenured African-American faculty member in the university, and a graduate of UNC Chapel Hill, by the way, for our North Carolinians here. And he was also the first to make African-American history and culture the focus of his teaching and scholarship and learning. So the Roberson Project seeks to honor Houston Roberson's inspiring legacies here at Sewanee, his devotion to rigorous teaching, his pursuit of scholarship, his dedication to social justice, and the personal example he set in every setting of high moral character. In doing so, the Roberson Project seeks to help Sewanee, the university, the community surrounding it, generations of people who have lived in and regard this place as their home. We seek to help that Sewanee confront its history in order to seek a more just and a more equitable future for our and the nation's broad and diverse community. And speaking personally here, as someone who was seriously schooled by Professor Roberson on the subject of reparations, that's me. It is a special delight to be here making these introductions tonight. So allow me to start by saying that this series of events is the fruit born of collaboration between the Roberson Project and a host of campus offices and organizations. Allow me to thank, in particular, the Department of Economics, the campus chapter of the NAACP, the Ayers Multicultural Center, and also the program in Southern Studies. Indispensable support also has come from the offices of the Vice Provost for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, and from that of the University Chaplain. Additional generous support and funding comes from the University Lectures Committee and the Lectures Committee of the School of Theology, as well as a Legacies of American Slavery grant to the Roberson Project from the Council of Independent Colleges. Thank you all for your help in making this week of events possible. Several individuals deserve special recognition for their contributions because the events that we're doing this week are just the culmination of a series of events that we've held over the course of the semester. And these people, whether they pitched in on the panels we've held or on the Reparations book club, certainly need to be recognized. And at the top of the list, even tonight, our IT support team of Mo Ostrowski, Alex Price, Craig Parton, and Devin Villeray, who've made us technologically possible. We couldn't be here without them. Also, the team of the Roberson Project, and a special mention goes to Dr. Tiffany Moman, Kathy Solomon, October Camara, Clark Strickland, Silas McClung, and a special shout out to Dr. Andrew McGinn for leading the book club, and to Senior Clark Strickland for leading the campaign to bring our speakers here tonight. So there are many others that I should thank by name, so please know how grateful I am, even though in the interest of time, I'm not thanking you individually tonight. Allow me to add too that the Sewanee Bookstore, if you didn't notice, is offering copies of our co-author's book, From Here to Equality, in the entryway to Gary Hall. And Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen, I'm sure, will be happy to sign those copies after the presentation tonight. As some of you know, tonight's and tomorrow's events have been more than 2 years in the making. For one, Clark Strickland and I attended a conference in Durham, North Carolina, 2 years ago in September 1919, where Dr. Darity and Ms. Mullen were the featured presenters. Clark and I attended a packed house town hall meeting, much like the one that we will have here tomorrow, and I hope too will be a packed house. That will be at 2 o'clock in Convocation Hall, by the way. But Clark and I both left that energetic, sometimes tense, but urgent engagement with the ideas of Ms. Mullen and Dr. Darity with the same thought. We were not seated next to each other, but we came together at the end of that meeting and we had the same thought. We have to get these people to Sewanee. And thanks to Clark, we have. But there's another reason too that they're here tonight. For more than 2 years, we in the Roberson Project have been convinced that the subject of reparations for slavery, reparations at the national level, reparations at the local Sewanee level. The reparations is a subject, a question, a political and moral choice that we at Sewanee cannot evade. We cannot avoid it as citizens, most of us of this nation. That is with this nation's history and its origins inseparable from the history of chattel slavery. And we cannot avoid it as citizens of this university, as members of this community, whose own existence is owing to the wealth and the ambitions of an aggressively expansive white Southern civilization based fundamentally on human bondage. So for the Roberson Project, it has been our objective not to decide the question of reparations for this institution or this community, but to provide the forum, the space, the structure, and the information infrastructure to answer these questions for ourselves as individuals and as members of this university community. As far as the Roberson Project is concerned, what is most important is that we address the question, that we confront the moral challenge, and that we decide what to do, whether we do something small, whether we do something grand, whether we do nothing at all. But if we are the university that we say we are, we must, with our history, we must address and answer for ourselves the question of reparations for Black Americans in the 21st century. Now, that I'm sure most of you tonight recognize is the subtitle of the book, From Here to Equality, published in 2020 by our guests tonight. And that is why we have invited them to share their arguments for the obligation of this nation to pay reparations to end the wealth gap, the great and deep social divide between white Americans' disproportionately large share of wealth in this country compared to that of Black Americans who are the descendants of the enslaved. And also the descendants of the generations discriminated against and violently oppressed under Jim Crow, and are those even today who face continuing discrimination and stigmatization. So allow me to introduce our guests, our co-authors. First, Ms. Kirsten Mullen, on our far left, of course, is a folklorist, an educator, and a founder of Artifactual, an arts consulting practice, and Carolina Circuit Writers, a literary consortium that brings expressive writers of color to the Carolinas. She was a member of the Freeland Auger Bond Concept Development Team that was awarded the Smithsonian Institution's commission to design the National Museum of African American History and Culture. And under the auspices of the North Carolina Arts Council, she worked to expand the Coastal Folklife Survey. And as a member with the Community Folklife Documentation Institute, she has trained students to research and record the state's African American music heritage. She's also consulted on many exhibition projects and published broadly. Immediately to my left, Dr. William A. Darity, Jr. He is the Samuel Du Bois Cook Professor of Public Policy, African and African American Studies, and Economics, and the director of the Samuel Du Bois Cook Center on Social Equity at Duke University. He has served as chair of the Department of African and African American Studies, and he was the founding director of the Research Network on Racial and Ethnic Inequality at Duke. Dr. Darity's research and his teaching focus on inequality by race, class, and ethnicity, stratification economics, schooling and the racial achievement gap, skin shade and labor market outcomes, the economics of reparations, the Atlantic slave trade in the Industrial Revolution, and the history of economics. When Clark and I heard them speak, heard them present 2 years ago, we thought they were a powerhouse concentration of energy and ideas. And then reading their book, it too is a powerhouse publication. We are so fortunate to have them here in Sewanee and so grateful to them for coming. Please join me in welcoming them to the University of the South and our community here in Sewanee.
Good evening, and thank you for such a warm welcome. Kirsten and I are honored to have the opportunity to share our work with your community. We admire the University of the South for confronting its past and its present and opening its eyes towards the near future. And we'd like to thank the Roberson project team for arranging this visit for us, especially the director of the team, Professor Woody Register, whose efforts, I think, constitute a reckoning with this particular institution's history that comes out of an act of love. The only type of love that an alumna or alumnae of the university might be able to express. I understand he also did his PhD at Brown University, which is my alma mater, which is another institution with, shall we say, complicated and troubled history. And I have a great deal of affection for Brown University. So I'd also like to thank Clark Strickland in particular, who at the Black Communities Conference had the idea of bringing Kirsten and myself to your campus, as well as Professor Andy McGinn, whose book club we joined a couple of days ago, and Professor Tiffany Moman, as well as October Camera and Silas McClung. And we would also like to thank Ms. Kathy Solomon for shepherding us around and arranging and managing our visit, as well as Professors Katie Kurtz and Ben King in theology, who had us visit with their classes. And then, of course, Professor Catherine Tyson, who was a former student of mine at UNC at Chapel Hill, and Professor Anthony Donaldson, who reminded me that I had met him much earlier when he was a PhD student at North Carolina Central University. And so it's a pleasure to be here with all of you. I would like to open our presentation tonight by giving you an overview over the conditions of wealth inequality in the United States, both in general and specifically with respect to inequality on the basis of race in the United States. So in engaging in a discussion about wealth inequality, I've typically found it to be very useful to make a distinction between income and wealth. And this is because frequently the two concepts get confused. They get confused by individuals who are in the world of popular media, but they also get confused sometimes by academics themselves. Frequently people will talk about people who are rich, and what they will typically mean is that these individuals have very high levels of income. But from our perspective, to be truly rich, you should have a high level of wealth, and they're not the same things. So income is conceptually a flow of resources that an individual, a family, or household, or even a nation receives in a given or fixed amount of time. We usually focus on the year, so we talk often about annual income. Income is a flow of resources that is dominated by your earnings. There are individuals, of course, who might be receiving transfer payments from the government because their incomes are extremely low. And so they get an income supplement in the form of some type of transfer payment. And there are other individuals whose wealth level is so high that they receive interest income. It's a passive sort of income receipt that they receive as a consequence of the assets that they bear, earning them a rate of return. But the primary component of income for most individuals in this country and throughout the world is what they earn during a given amount of time. And this is in contrast with wealth, which is a stock of resources that an individual potentially can carry with them through time if they don't choose to draw upon that stock in the present moment. And it's the difference between what an individual owns and what an individual owes. Another way to think about it is the difference between your assets and your liabilities. It's actually the net value of your personal property. And this is different from income for a number of reasons. One of the key reasons is because actually wealth can substitute for income in a way in which income cannot substitute for wealth. That is to say, if you have a major shortfall in your income, it's possible for you to offset it by drawing down your stock of wealth. This means that you would have a greater degree of economic opportunity, a greater degree of economic security, and a greater degree of overall well-being if your wealth level is higher. It also constitutes, in general, a buffer against unexpected conditions where there's going to be some challenge made to your spending requirements, a job loss, a medical emergency, and the like. A high level of wealth provides you with a buffer. In addition, it facilitates political participation in a country in which our influence over the electoral process is heavily influenced by the degree of money that we possess. It also enables wealthier families to purchase their way into higher amenity neighborhoods, also to provide their offspring with quality education and schooling, as well as provide their offspring when they reach their teen and young adult years the opportunity to buy a quality college or university education without coming out on the other side with a significant amount of student loan debt. And the final point that I'd like to make at this stage is that it enables the older generation to provide gifts and bequests to future generations. Now, we usually associate the transmission of resources across generations primarily with inheritances, but we want to emphasize that there's actually another dimension of this transmission process that is perhaps even more important. Even though the amounts may not be as large as what we identify with inheritances, something that economists refer to as inter-vivos, transfers that take place while the donor is still living to the recipient. You could think of it as a gift, if you like. Those kinds of transfers are extremely significant, not just because of their amounts, but because frequently of their timing. And so, for example, this might include a family that decides to provide a car to their son or daughter at the point at which the young person finishes high school, or a family where the parents and grandparents provide
the down payment on a mortgage, which enables their children or grandchildren to get into a home as a source of wealth and property. It could involve a situation in which there's a transfer of resources to the still succeeding generation in the form of a trust account that might be set up for the grandchild. So wealth matters because wealth structures your opportunity to fully participate economically in this society. So I want to first begin by highlighting the extent of wealth inequality in the United States. And at this point in the conversation, I'm going to be talking exclusively about the overall degree of wealth inequality that applies to all Americans. And so I want to begin by giving you the image of what I like to refer to as the fish diagram. And the fish diagram, as you can see, represents the share of wealth going to the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution in the United States. That's represented by the blue line, and the share going to the top 0.1% of the wealth holders in the United States, and that's represented by the red line. And I want to re-emphasize that that's the top 0.1%. It is not 10%, it is not 1%, it's 1/10 of 1% of wealth holders in the United States. And what's particularly striking about this diagram is if you look at the progression from 1917 up to the present, and the diagram breaks off at about 2015 or so, but I can assure you that the situation doesn't look very different in the present moment. If anything, I think our best estimates suggest that the red line has crossed the blue line as of 2019 and 2020. But what this indicates is that as of the late 1930s, there was a situation in which the share of wealth held by the top 0.1% of the nation's population exceeded the share of wealth held by the bottom 90%. And by 2015 or so, we have a convergence in those shares of wealth that was unseen since 1937. Okay. What this means in turn is that the top 0.1% of the nation's wealth holders hold a share of wealth that is equivalent to the bottom 90% of the wealth distribution. So, a few years ago when we had a lot of attention being drawn to the top 1%, this is a situation where we're trying to draw attention to the top 0.1%. Now, the 1% matters too. We'll come to that in a moment. Okay. So I had emphasized at the beginning of this phase of our conversation that income and wealth are different concepts. I want to reinforce that by looking at the differences between the income and wealth distributions. And the income distribution is fairly uneven in the United States, but it is not as starkly uneven as the wealth distribution. So if you look at the column, the first column of data from 2015, we can see that the top 0.1% of income holders have about 11% of the nation's income, while the bottom 90% have 50% of the nation's income. And it's interesting to note further that if you look at the top 10%, they also have half of the nation's income. But if we look at the wealth distribution, we find that the top 0.1% has a share that is equivalent to the bottom 90%, and the top 10% of the wealth distribution has 77% of the nation's wealth, and the top 1% has 40%. So this is the vaunted 1% that the opportunity movement was engaged in, the Occupy movement was engaged in talking about. Okay. So now I want to make a shift to thinking about wealth inequality on the basis of race as opposed to the general degree of wealth inequality in the United States. And I want to propose that there are two perspectives that we can draw to thinking about the disparity in wealth on the basis of race in the United States. If you look at the upper part of the diagram, it displays a picture of the difference in wealth between Black and white households that's based upon a measure that we refer to as the median. If you look at the bottom portion of the diagram, you will see a depiction of the wealth gap that's based upon the mean. What's the significance of this difference? Well, the median refers to the households that are at the middle of the distribution, the center of the distribution. And these are, of course, frequently treated as households that are more representative of the standard circumstances that are experienced by most households in the United States. So a lot of people are drawn to consideration of the mean gap as being the pertinent one because it's not affected by outlier values, extremely high values of wealth or extremely low values of wealth that exist on either end of the distribution. Now, those outlier values do play a role, though, in the construction of the mean, because the mean is the ratio of the total amount of wealth held by a group divided by the number of households. And so, the mean, in some sense, does get contaminated by the outlying values. And so, as a consequence, some people would argue that we should focus on the median rather than the mean. And we'll see that in this diagram that numerically there is a substantial difference in the absolute dollar gap that's associated with the median versus the mean. As we indicate here, the median gap is approximately $164,000, but the mean gap is closer to $841,000. And there are differences in the implications for the potential for closing that gap through household saving activity. Black households would have to save 100% of their income for almost 4 consecutive years to close the gap at the median, but to close the gap at the mean, they would have to save 100% of their income for 14 consecutive years. Okay? So closing the gap at the mean is considerably more challenging than closing it at the median. Now, some of you may have heard of a policy proposal that is referred to as baby bonds. Not actually a bond, it's a trust account for each newborn infant that's calibrated on the basis of the infant's family's wealth level. And the state of Connecticut has recently adopted something that is akin to a baby bonds proposal. Personally, I helped develop the idea of a baby bonds proposal, but at the time that I worked on it, I was mistaken in thinking that it would play an important role in eliminating the Black-white wealth gap. And my mistake was attributable to the fact that I was focused on the Black-white wealth gap at the median rather than at the mean. And so what I would like to submit to you this evening is that it is actually the mean differential that we should pay attention to when we are thinking about the Black-white wealth differential. And there's 2 reasons for that I'd like to highlight. The first reason is because wealth is so densely concentrated in the United States, 97% of the wealth that is held by white households is held by white households that have a net worth above the white median. Okay? Let me reinforce that. 97% of the wealth that is held by white households is held by those white households that have a net worth above the white median. So if we were to focus exclusively on the middle of the distributions at the median households, we would be neglecting a vast amount of wealth that is held by those households that are above the median. And hence, we would be neglecting a vast amount of the wealth. That's one reason. The second reason is associated with the fact that this differential in wealth holding is not exclusively due to the presence of a handful of extraordinarily rich white billionaires. Now, there are a handful of extraordinarily rich white billionaires, but that doesn't explain this wealth differential in toto. In fact, 25% of all white households in the United States have a net worth in excess of $1 million. And that's only true for 4% of Black households. So as a consequence, we argue that if you are concerned about addressing the racial wealth gap, you need to address the gap at the mean rather than at the median. Now, this is a slide that we inserted because frequently when we give presentations on the racial wealth gap, there's somebody in the audience that says, well, you know, Black people are younger than white people, and so that's what explains why there is this difference in wealth. And as Black people age, the wealth differential will narrow. And so as a preemptive strategy, we include this slide in our conversation where you can see that if anything, as individuals age in the United States, whether you're looking at the median difference, which is represented by the left-hand curves in the diagram, or you're looking at the mean differential, which is represented by the right-hand curves in the diagram, there's an explosive growth in the difference in wealth between the time in which individuals are in their late 20s and early 30s to the time in which they reach their 60s. So if anything, aging does not explain the wealth gap or does not explain it away. In fact, as people become older, the wealth gap becomes considerably wider. Now, in this slide, there's an attempt to provide you with some information about what the wealth distribution looks like within other racial or ethnic groups besides the white population writ large. And what becomes apparent is the wealth distribution is highly uneven within all racial groups in the United States. I mean, it's comparably uneven across all racial wealth groups in the United States. Black, whites, and Latinos, we find that the upper 10% of wealth holders in those communities have 75% of the nation's wealth, which is quite similar to the 77% figure I showed you for the overall wealth distribution in the United States. And that 75 to 77% figure applies to white Americans as well. Approximately 40% of all wealth is held by the top 1% of each group, and less than 3% of all wealth is held by the bottom 50% of each group. So the pattern of intergroup wealth inequality is as pronounced as the pattern of intragroup wealth inequality, which is represented here. But there is an important difference. And that important difference is associated with the fact that the uneven distribution of wealth within, say, the Black community is an uneven distribution that takes place over a disproportionately smaller share of the nation's wealth than the total amount that is held by white households. Here's another way to think about what I just said. Black Americans who are descendants of persons enslaved in the United States constitute about 12% of the nation's population, but they possess less than 2% of the nation's wealth. And it is that less than 2% that is so unevenly distributed. In contrast, white Americans constitute closer to 70% of the nation's population, but possess closer to 93 to 94% of the nation's wealth. So it is that much larger proportion of the nation's wealth that is also distributed very unevenly across white Americans. In this particular slide, we provide some information to try to address the intersectional question. What's the relationship between wealth, race, and gender? And we wanted to look in particular at women who are living alone to avoid trying to unpackage the full question of how we we think about wealth for individuals who are partnered. So we looked at white women who are single and elderly, but we also wanted to make comparisons across women who were single and elderly by education levels. So we specifically started this phase of our investigation by looking at white women who graduated from college and Black women who graduated from college who are 60 years of age or older. And we find that white women who graduated from college who are living alone have 35 times the level of wealth of Black women who graduated from college who are in their 60s. White women without college degrees have 5 times the wealth of Black women without college degrees, but interestingly enough, 5.5 times the wealth of Black women who do have college degrees. So we're convinced that the question of wealth inequality in the United States is not a question that is addressed by thinking about age or by thinking about gender. It is a race problem. Okay, so let's be direct about that. And if we think about the causes of wealth inequality, we're going to argue that the racial wealth gap or the Black-white wealth gap is largely a product of government policy stemming from the end of slavery to the present moment. And we'd like to highlight some of those government policies. In 1865, as the war was winding to an end, the federal government made a commitment to the formerly enslaved to provide them with land grants, 40 acres, land grants as restitution for the years of bondage. Unfortunately, those land grants were never delivered to the formerly enslaved. There was an initial act of providing 40,000 of the 4 million formerly enslaved with 400,000 acres out of an allotment under Sherman's Special Field Orders number 15 that designated 5.3 million acres of land for the freedmen. There was an allotment that was made, but it was taken away and returned to the former slaveholders by President Andrew Johnson. So that's the first moment where the racial wealth gap emerges, the denial of the freedmen of any initial land stake or grub stake in the United States. And this occurs at the same time that the federal government is providing 1.5 million white Americans with 160 acres land grants in the Western Territories under the Homestead Act of 1862. So white families receive 160 acres. Black families were promised 40-acre land grants, 1/4 of the 160, and didn't even get that. So that's the beginning point. The second phase of government policies is associated with a period of inaction, where the federal government turns its head away from a series of 100 massacres that took place in the United States from the end of the Civil War to the beginning of World War II, where Black lives were taken and Black property was seized and appropriated by the white terrorists to become their own, another dimension of creating or forging or extending the racial wealth gap. And then the last period that we'd like to highlight concerns the 20th century, where the federal government shifts away from asset building on the basis of land distribution to asset building on the basis of home ownership promotion. And when that shift is made, it's made in a discriminatory fashion. So under the terms of the Federal Housing Administration's practices, we have the introduction of redlining, which leads to credit starvation for potential Black homeowners and credit starvation for Black neighborhoods. And we also have the discriminatory application of the GI Bill, where white GIs or white veterans of World War II are given substantial support for home buying and business ownership, support that's denied to Black veterans. Excuse me. So I've
I'm not going to talk about this slide, but what I want to conclude with in the conversation this evening is to talk very briefly about alternative explanations for the wealth gap. So our explanation is it's a product of government policy, and as a consequence, the government has the responsibility for correcting the racial wealth gap. But there are a number of folks who believe quite fervently that the racial wealth gap is due to deficient behavior on the part of Black Americans. So, for example, there are those who say, well, if we only equalized education between Blacks and whites, we would close the racial wealth gap. But that's a claim that's inconsistent with the fact that Black heads of household with a college degree have 2/3 of the net worth of white heads of household who never finished high school. Another argument that's frequently made is if we had similar family structures between Blacks and whites, if there were fewer female-headed families among Black Americans, that we would be able to close the racial wealth gap. But that's inconsistent with the fact that single-parent white families have approximately 2 times the wealth of 2-parent Black families. And then a final argument that I'll mention, there's a number of these, but a final argument that I'll mention right now is the claim that the wealth gap is attributable to differences in financial behavior between Blacks and whites. So one argument is that, if we had more financial literacy for Black Americans, we would close the racial wealth gap. Our position is, if you give financial literacy, but you don't give people any resources to manage, it's the equivalent of giving them a recipe without any ingredients. But furthermore, there's no significant evidence that once you control for level of income, that there's any significant difference in financial knowledge between Blacks and whites. And similarly, once you control for household income, there's no significant difference in the amount of savings that Blacks and whites engage in. In fact, in some income categories, the Black savings rate is actually higher than the white savings rate. So I will stop there and do my tag team to Kirsten Mullen.
Those experiments and whether I can.
We're going backwards. Yeah, I'm trying to see where yours begins. Here we go. That's the button.
Good evening. Good evening. Is this the South, right? Thank you. So, Resurrecting the Promise of 40 Acres. Our book, From Here to Equality, Reparations for Black Americans in the 21st Century, was 10 years in the making. 10 years spent reading and conducting research and thinking about the meaning of reparations. After completely changing our approach to the structure of the narrative, we rewrote the book 4 times. So in addition to immersing ourselves in the nation's history, a process that has involved both examining scores of primary documents and critically analyzing texts we were introduced to when we were students, we also have collected stories about individual Black and white families' wealth positions, and many Black American descendants have told us about the injuries, the dispossessions, the harms that they and members of their family have suffered at the hands of the state or the federal government. We've taken a special interest in a host of reparations initiatives that have transpired across the globe and examined the strengths and weaknesses of those redress efforts. Many people focus their attention on quote unquote slave reparations, but we actually recoil at the mention of this appellation because the case for reparations is based on so much more. I mean, any comment on some of these things in his presentation. But I want to talk about the debt that's owed to these Black American descendants and the amount of the debt. I also want to speak in some detail about how it was created and how it was maintained. Next, I will identify the culpable party, that is, who is responsible for paying this debt and why it is theirs to pay. And lastly, I will share some of the lessons we have learned from our examination of both domestic and international precedents for reparations. All right. If you stick a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, there's no progress. If you pull it all the way out, that's not progress. Progress is healing the wound that the blow made, and they haven't even pulled the knife out, much less heal the wound. They won't even admit the knife is there. This is Malcolm X in 1964. When we visited Professor Katie Kurtz's Religion and American History class yesterday, she asked about the off-ramps to reparations, the possibly well-meaning intentions of some who believe reparations should be paid, but only after we have eliminated racism or only after we have restructured all of the American economy. We heartily disagree with these points of view. Those things, if they happen at all, can take place later and are not a condition for reparations. We liken Malcolm X's quote to what we call piecemeal reparations, not reparations at all, but bit by bit, or what my mother would call half a loaf approaches, like the ones that many colleges and universities and cities and states have adopted when they engage in the process of changing the name of or tearing down a building that had been erected to honor a family that enslaved human chattel or exhibited violently racist behaviors post-bellum. Sewanee is not unique in this endeavor. The University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill is another school that was built by slaveholders, and the naming of many buildings and campus street names pay homage to lost cause advocates. Yesterday, someone said, the entire Sewanee campus is a monument to the Confederacy. Do you want to spend the next millennium working on dismantling building names? Or do you want to take the lead on a national reparations program? Other cities have thrown themselves into enacting a housing voucher program like the one in Evanston, Illinois, where Blacks who were discriminated against by the city and the housing market between 1919 and 1969 and still live in Evanston can receive up to $25,000 toward the maintenance or repair of a house in the city or towards the purchase of a new home, when the average price of a new home is $420,000. So you get $25,000 to help you buy this $420,000 home. That's not reparations. Currently, Evanston has raised funds to make a total of 16 awards, an amount that cannot possibly cover all the potential cases of abuse. In Chicago, years of unchecked violent and abusive practice, the practice of police acting on the orders of their commanding officer, finally are being addressed. Still, other cities have confessed their implication in the enslavement of Black people. That would be Providence, Rhode Island, and the quote, direct, indirect, intentional, and unintentional harms caused by racialized city contracts and residential policies. This is what Austin, Texas is engaging in currently. Each of these efforts is the equivalent of pulling the knife out 3 inches. They provide some degree of relief, but they do not eliminate the pain, nor do they compensate for the harm. The gaping wound is still present, and only reparations can repair the harm. We applaud cities and states for acknowledging the decades of atrocities directed against their Black residents. However desirable local initiatives may be, they cannot be described accurately as reparations. To be precise, these acts are racial equity initiatives. Specificity and language are important. Justice demands proprietariness about the meaning of reparations, and we object to these kinds of piecemeal and misleading labels. True reparations only can come from a full-scale program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure for a grievous injustice, or ARC, A-R-C. But before we get to ARC, or what reparations is and what reparations is not, I'd like you to participate in a quick poll. All right. So does everyone have a set of numbers, 1 to 5? Okay. So I'd like everyone to please stand. This will be quick. All right. So, all right. So here's the poll question. Can you all see this? The picture? Okay. This is green. Hello? Yes, all right. Excellent, thank you. All right, so which American states have compensated Black victims of white terror? Is it number 1, North Carolina? It's 1898 Wilmington insurrection. Is it number 2, Oklahoma? Since the 1921 Tulsa race riots where Black Wall Street was located? Is it Florida? Where the 1923 Rosewood Massacre occurred. There was a film, some of you may have seen, Rosewood. Is it all of the above or none of the above? Please vote. Raise your number in the air. These are small, it's hard to see them. So let's do this differently. All who believe it's number 1, raise your hand, raise your number. No one. Number 2, Oklahoma. Couple for Oklahoma. Rosewood, Florida. If 1, 2, 1, 2. All of the above. 1, none of the above. It's actually Rosewood, Florida. All right, thank you. Now I will say that only 9 individuals received reparations. The level of proof was incredibly high. Individuals had to prove that they had, that they or their direct antecedents had deeds of property that were destroyed. Now, this was the case after the courthouse records had been destroyed. So how one was able to make that proof is quite extraordinary. But anyway, thank you. First poll. So reparations, a program of acknowledgement, redress, and closure. So acknowledgement, by this we mean the culpable party's admission of responsibility for the atrocity. So admission would include an enumeration of the damages inflicted upon the victims and the advantages appropriated by the culpable party and an agreement to undertake redress. So redress for us is an act of restitution. These are the steps taken to heal the wound, as we spoke of earlier. And for us, redress would be most significantly made in the form of monetary payments. So then closure, the C of ARC, an agreement by both the victims and the perpetrators that the account has been settled. Representatives chosen by members of the aggrieved community would communicate with the culpable party to establish the point at which restitution is adequate for the debt to be paid. So then no further claims by the victims would be made unless new atrocities were committed or there was a revisitation of some of the older former atrocities. Eligibility. So we've established 2 criteria. Both of which would need to be met. So at least one ancestor would have, it would be critical, you know, it was not critical, it is imperative that the individual was able to trace their ancestor, their lineage to at least one person who had been enslaved in the United States. And second, these are individuals who have self-identified for at least 12 years prior to the enactment of a reparations program or the creation of a reparations study commission as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro. So there are three phases of atrocities. Sandy's talked about some of these just briefly, and I'm going to talk about them in a little bit more detail. So the first, chattel slavery. So this is the crucible, that produces white supremacy. Some people say, oh, racism came first, or white supremacy came first. We think it was the reverse, and we're not the only people who, who say this. The historian Eric Williams also, very famously said, people created this institution of slavery, and then they came up with justifications for their actions. Right? So, chattel slavery was de facto an affirmative action program for white people. An immoral act, it was sanctioned by the federal government, which declared it a legal institution. The Jim Crow era, this is legal segregation in America, also known as American apartheid. This is a period, as Sandy mentioned, when at least 100 massacres took place and their consequences. The historian Alan Trelease called this 100-year period the reign of white terror. Immediately after the end of the Civil War, when newly emancipated Black people attempted to claim full citizenship. And by this, I mean, they were attempting to establish credit, to purchase property, to exercise the right to vote and run for public office, to negotiate employment contracts, to have their disputes heard by the courts. White mobsters determined to stop them and to recreate conditions as close to those of enslavement as possible, threatened, intimidated, beat, maimed, and murdered them, rather than allow them to co-govern and coexist with them. This was precisely what happened in Colfax, Louisiana in 1873, in Coushatta, Louisiana, and Vicksburg, Mississippi in 1874, in Fort Bend County, Texas in 1888, Wilmington, North Carolina in 1898, Atlanta, 1906. In fact, in Wilmington, Atlanta, and Fort Bend County, you get the sense that there was a playbook that these individuals used, because the white Democrats in each instance published their white Democratic Declaration of Independence. Right? And this is, you have Elaine, Arkansas, 1919, Tulsa, Oklahoma, 1921, Rosewood, Florida, 1923, just to name a few. But one of the members who signed that Wilmington, North Carolina, White Men's Declaration of Independence proclaimed, quote, "We hereby declare that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by men of African origin." Sound familiar? Oops, sorry. Ongoing atrocities. Mass incarceration, police executions of unarmed Black people, sustained credit, housing, and employment discrimination, and the immense Black-white wealth disparity. This is what's happening today. So Black American descendants of US slavery have borne and continue to bear the undue burden of the cumulative effects of all three of these phases of the nation's trajectory of racial injustice. Okay. I'm gonna slide past a couple of these, because we've talked about these already. Okay. All right. So before we move a little further, we have another poll. Okay. So this one we'll do sitting down. All right. So the question here is, in 1959, Blacks were 3 times more likely than whites to live in poverty. So in 1959, Black people were 3 times more likely than whites to live in poverty. So the question is, what do the numbers look like today? Are there equal numbers or equal proportions of Blacks and whites currently living in poverty? Are Blacks today 2 times more likely to live in poverty than whites? 2.5 times more likely? 3 times more likely? Or 4 times more likely? Who thinks that Blacks now are equally proportionate to whites living in poverty? Raise a hand. Okay, no one. Twice as likely. So have things gotten better? A little better. Nope. 2.5 times more likely. Several, okay. 4. 3 times more likely, so nothing's changed. Goodly number. And then 4 times more likely, so it's even worse. So it's actually 3 times more likely. So no improvement, but at least it's not getting worse, right? Okay. So calculating the Black-white wealth gap. So to close the gap at the median, just saying spoke about a little bit earlier, so it's approximately $164,000. Black households would have to save 100% of their income for almost 4 consecutive years. To close the gap at the mean, approximately $841,000, Black households would have to save 100% of their income for 14 consecutive years. So a reparations plan should target the mean rather than the median, as we spoke of earlier. The national median net worth for all households was an estimated $97,300,000, while 20% of white and Black families met the wealth criteria. 64%, or almost 2/3 of Black families, have a net worth that is less than the median. So repeating again, half of white families have a net worth that qualifies them for the top 2 wealth quintiles. So more than 25% of white families have a net worth of at least $1 million or more, which I think is a surprise to a lot of people, but only 4% of Black families meet this standard. So it may have, I think this whole conversation about the mean and the median is really important. And I just want to do a quick little exercise here to sort of demonstrate how those numbers can really vary. So when you're looking at the mean, let's say we're looking at these 5 numbers, 1, 2, 7, 40, and 50. So the mean is basically the average. You've got 5 numbers, 1 and 2 is 3, plus 7 is 10, 50 and 50. So the average of those numbers is 20. That's your mean. But the median, on the other hand, is a number that falls in the middle, regardless of what's at the top and what's at the bottom. So the median is 7. So if someone asks you, would you rather have, let's say we're talking about dollars, which would you rather have? I mean, you obviously want to have, the larger number, unless you're just feeling really generous. So culpability, a matter of national responsibility. Black reparations are not a matter of personal or individual institutional guilt. Black reparations are a matter of national responsibility. I'd like to read that again. Black reparations are not a matter of personal or individual institutional guilt. Black reparations are a matter of national responsibility. Sometimes we'll hear, individuals whose family migrated to the United States. They'll say, well, we weren't here when all of these atrocities occurred. We shouldn't be liable. But we would argue that when you migrate to a country, you migrate to its history and to its obligations. And it's important to do that homework, to do that research so that you know what has transpired. Because once you come to this country, the country is doing things in your name. So, we all have these responsibilities that we need to be aware of. But piecemeal efforts are insufficient. So I'd like to give you some reasons why we say these piecemeal, half a loaf, or bit by bit efforts do not add up to restitution. All right. So, first of all, piecemeal efforts are not restitution. Most efforts frequently constitute acknowledgement admitting that atrocities were committed. This is something that the United States has already done, in fact. These measures are often followed by inadequate attempts at redress. The allocation of funds for research or for the construction of memorials, for example, rather than any substantial compensatory payments to Black Americans. Piecemeal efforts are subscale. Most states, most localities, and individual institutions do not have the resources to repay on anything like the scale that is necessary. At least $14 trillion on the low end is required to eliminate the Black-white wealth disparity. Piecemeal efforts are not systemic. Incremental efforts will not fundamentally change the conditions of structural racial economic inequality for Black Americans in this country. So though piecemeal initiatives are admirable in their acknowledgement of the existence of debt, these incremental efforts will not fundamentally change the conditions of structural racial economic inequality. But have faith. There are grounds for optimism for federal reparations. The trend is moving in the right direction. We realize, it's a little bit hard to see. We realize that 30% is not a majority, but it's a huge improvement over 4%. For a 20-year period between 2000 and 2016-18, the advocates, individuals who were advocating for reparations increased by about 1% per year. And then there was a significant jump in 2020 in the positive, the growth of advocacy for monetary payments for Black Americans. So support is growing as well among Black Americans. So, for us, all of this is good news. And we don't have a crystal ball. So, we're not able to say that the trend will continue in this direction, but we are very much encouraged by the significant change that we are seeing currently. So the question is, will you spearhead this initiative? Will you engage your friends, your classmates, your colleagues, and your peers at other cultural institutions in this righteous cause? So I want to talk a little bit about some of the things that we've learned from other cases, some of the precedents for reparations. So we're going to talk just specifically just a little bit about 5 precedents that we have come across. So in the United States, post 9/11, reparations for victims' families was a case that, basically, George Bush, Bush II, felt that we needed to do something quickly, we needed to do something really dramatic, and it was really important to show to the world how much Americans take care of their own. And that was what he, that was how he was phrasing this. And so he oh goodness, what is the gentleman's name? John Ashcroft decided that they would select a special, what's it called? Say, remind me, what was the name? A special, not special advisor, special master was the title that was given to Kenneth Feinberg. And he alone was empowered to determine who would receive reparations and how much. Now that's a very unusual set of circumstances, and to my knowledge, it's never been repeated. And in fact, Kenneth Feinberg himself now says that that should not have happened in that way, but that's precisely what happened. Now, curiously, he determined the amount of reparations that each individual victim would receive based on their income at the time. Okay? So not necessarily, what they may have earned eventually. So, one example to think about is, say you had several people who worked in the World Trade Center, and one of them was studying, maybe one of them already had earned an advanced degree and was working on a law degree or working on an MBA. But on 9/11, that person was working, delivering pizza and was being paid $12 an hour. But in that same building on the 67th floor in the financial offices of Cantor Fitzgerald, there was an individual who was already making $1.6 million a year and $400,000 to $500,000 bonuses. So Kenneth Feinberg gave the individual who was already making a huge salary a much higher reparations payment than did the individual who had a lot of potential, but in that moment was making $12 an hour. He's also said that was a mistake, but that's exactly what he did. Okay. So the post-Sandy Hook reparations, this is after the horrible 2012 school shooting. So interestingly, the families were having a lot of difficulty with the agents of the federal government who were negotiating the reparations in that case. There was an initiative to create a community center that would have the children's names on the outside of the building, which many of the parents objected to. They were saying it was causing them so much grief every day to have to drive by that building and see their children's names on it. Some of the funds were being directed to therapy sessions for, school children, for their families. Some of the funds were being directed to bullying therapy sessions. And the parents said, we need to have control of that money, and we will decide what we will do with it. If we want to create foundations in our children's names, then that should be our purview. So interestingly, Kenneth Feinberg was brought in to Sandy Hook, but this was after 9/11. And with the wisdom of what he had learned at 9/11, he said, absolutely, the money needs to go directly to the families, and they need to have the right to decide how those funds will be spent. And then the third domestic case that we have looked at is that of the Japanese Americans who were unlawfully interned during World War II. And ultimately, about 127,000 of those victims received reparations payments of about $20,000 about 45 years later. Now, some people will say $20,000, that's really not a lot of money, but it's $20,000 in 1988 dollars, which would be about $80,000, $90,000 today. And some of these families were quite large. So if you had a family of 5 or 6, individuals, you'd be talking about something along the lines of $300,000 or so in today's dollars. Okay. So then we also looked at some reparations programs internationally. And one that many people are aware of is that of the German reparations case. And this is for victims of the Holocaust. And over $69 billion have been spent to date. And then when COVID hit, the German government decided that they would reinvest in the still living victims of the Holocaust. And they began pouring more money into their accounts as a consequence of the hardships that they were experiencing during COVID. One of the interesting things about that too is that the German case, the decision was made very early, still in the 1950s, to focus first and foremost on the money. And said, we'll get the planning, we'll get the education, we'll get what eventually became known as denazification. We'll deal with that later. And I think it was somewhat wise on their part, because they understood that there will be this kind of evolution of our understanding of what denazification should look like. But they recognized that there were living people who were suffering in that moment, and that they wanted to provide some kind of restitution to them. Interestingly, they never did, and have not to this day, apologized for the Holocaust, which is a source of bitterness for a lot of people. Something else I was going to say about that case. It may come to me a little bit later. So, and then lastly, kind of a cautionary tale is the Truth and Reconciliation, quote unquote, reparations program in post-apartheid South Africa. So we would argue that this was really an unsuccessful effort, in that, first of all, the elimination of the racial wealth gap, or even any attempts to determine the amount of the racial wealth gap, was never part of that program. They were much more concerned with truth-telling, but there were difficulties with that as well, in that the perpetrators of the harms were allowed equal time, equal floor, and almost equal authority to tell their stories. And then the government turned around and granted amnesty to almost all of them. And so today, only a tiny, tiny, tiny percentage of the individuals who were victimized by those, decades of harms during the white regime have received any form of restitution, and poverty is widespread in South Africa. So we have time, I hope, for, oops, can't get this to advance. Try here. There we go. So key lessons learned. All right. So one of the lessons we've learned is that leadership from within the communities most affected is essential to ignite action and to ensure that restitution is comprehensive and sufficient. 2, movement pressure outside of the political system is effective when it is combined with consenting formal political leadership, for example, prime ministers, members of Congress, and high-profile bipartisan and multi-party commissions. So, of course, the prime ministers were very active in the case of the Holocaust victims. Members of Congress would, ideally be involved in the case of Black American descendants of U.S. slavery. Thirdly, political commissions must have the proper mandate, focused not on repayment for demonstrable individual atrocities, but on the comprehensive costs of social systems of oppression. This was what was missing in the South African case. Fourthly, even when reparations are politically unpopular, significant payment and restitution can be achieved. So at the height of the discussions of reparations for Holocaust victims, only 31% of the German populace supported that movement. In fact, the German Democratic Christian Party never reached more than 20% of support, and yet the matter carried. Okay. Now, we're not suggesting that that's likely to happen in the United States. We're going to need a large majority of, or very close to majority, if not a supermajority of Americans, to be supportive of reparations for Black American descendants of U.S. slavery for this to happen. But it has happened differently in other places. Okay. An enumeration of contingencies must be made to ensure the payments are made under challenging circumstances. One of the things that I learned about the German case is that there is legislation that spells out exactly what should happen if the German government is financially strapped. So, if the currency is devalued, if they're at war with other countries, if they have other debts, they still have to pay reparations to those Holocaust victims. It's quite interesting. That's part of their legislation. Work performed by a study commission for reparations must be completed in a timely manner within a maximum horizon of 18 months. This is precisely the amount of time that the Japanese American Study Commission on Reparations had to do its research. It conducted 11 hearings in 10 cities across the United States. Some 75,000 people testified, many of them in person, but others were invited to submit up to 10 pages of testimony, which was all published and part of the federal record. And then they began to identify the individuals who would receive compensation and to cut checks all inside of 18 months. It can be done. Financial goals of reparations projects should be met within a decade. Valuing human life and coming to agreement on quote unquote sufficient payment is difficult, but within limits, identical payments are ultimately preferable. And then lastly, financial outlay should be combined with educational, historical, and narrative efforts to ensure that the case for reparations is well understood in the public ethos. So in fact, the Japanese American reparations efforts included funds for education, both for citizens in California and across the United States. But the budget for that education initiative was gutted by 90% under Bill Clinton's presidential term. So it's really important to make sure that those funds are protected. And we would say that for at least 3 generations, we would need to see, textbooks for K through 12 and college students that tell the full story of American history need to be in place so that we don't find ourselves, in this space one more time. So now we're going to do one last poll. This is a 2-parter. Mike. So this is a courtesy of one of our colleagues, Ira Katz-Nelson's research. And he's done a lot of studying to look at the GI Bill. So who received the GI Bill benefits? And Sandy just mentioned, the GI Bill was made available to the returning veterans. And these are funds that could be used as for education allowance, unemployment allowance, but also funds to purchase a home, to purchase a farm, to purchase a business. And so Ira Katz-Nelson's done a tremendous amount of research on who receives GI Bill benefits, but we're going to focus on Mississippi in 1947, when 3,229 veterans received GI Bill benefits. And we're talking about not the education benefits, but those that could be used to purchase a house, a farm, a business, or a house, farm, and business, those 3 things. Okay, so the question is, how many of those 3,229 benefits in Mississippi in 1947 went to non-white veterans? Okay. So I propose some options. 2, 1,006, 2,347, 896, and 73. Okay. How many think that 2 Black veterans received GI Bill benefits in 1949? We have 3, 4, okay, 5, 1,006, Mississippi. 1, 2,347. None. 896. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. 73. The majority. You are mostly right. It's 2. 2. 2. All right. So we move to New York. This is the last one. This is New York and the northern part of New Jersey. And I think, he was looking at these 2 in part because I think the assumption was that the administrators of these benefits may have been more liberal. All right. So 67,000 veterans, that's me beeping, 67,000 veterans received the GI Bill it's again 1947 in New York and northern New Jersey. And so the question is, how many non-white veterans also got the GI Bill? Was it 23,000, 18,000, 560, 590, fewer than 100, or 14,500? Okay, 67,000. How many think the 23,000? No takers. 18,000. You're on to me. 590. Very good. Thank you. Less than 100. And 14,500. Thank you. The answer is less than 100. So liberal New York and New Jersey, not so much. Okay. Thank you. Now for your questions. So, we sat here.
Why don't we just stay here? Yeah, that might be easiest.
So we will pass the mic through the audience. For those who have questions, just raise your hands and we'll come to you.
In your talk, you mentioned a figure of, I don't know, it was in the trillions of dollars that would make the gap of the wealth gap be equal. And you also said that just taking the knife out part way doesn't do any good. So how can we make the gap or, you know, not have a gap with a figure that is not realistic to be able to meet?
So I'm not sure what you mean by a figure that's not realistic.
Well, there was a figure that gap was like
This is a 14 trillion.
At least
trillion.
$14 trillion, yeah.
Okay. So is that a realistic figure? I mean, it seems to me that that's not a realistic figure for us to be able to make reparations of that figure in our country.
Well, okay. go
Well, I guess
ahead.
I want to know why you think it's unrealistic.
Yeah.
Well, because we just had a big fight in Congress about, a bill.
So you're saying that you don't think it's politically feasible?
Yes,
But that's
Okay.
different from
Same.
being unrealistic, because unrealistic would suggest that it's a number that is unfathomably large. But given the types of expenditures that the federal government has made in response to the Great Recession and in response to the COVID-19 crisis under the American CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan, it's quite clear that that's a number that is feasible.
okay,
Okay.
okay.
But now, yes, critical question. Would the current Congress ever adopt a reparations plan? Well, no, absolutely not. And that means that the political task is to change who is in Congress and to avoid the process of a drive for minority rule in the United States that's associated with the behavior of the individuals who invaded the Capitol on January 6th and attempted to try to execute a coup d'etat. So there is a huge political project that's involved here, but it's not one that is driven by the impossibility of achieving a number like $14 trillion, particularly since we've argued that it's something that should be done no longer than, over a period no longer than a decade. But if you were to divide the $14 trillion by 10 years, then it becomes a figure that's actually less than what the federal government recently has been spending in response to the COVID-19 crisis. Yeah.
Thank you.
I mean, the federal government has misappropriated $6.8 trillion in defense. Okay? They cannot account for $6.8 trillion, the Department of Defense, currently. There's my phone again.
Yeah.
Hello, I'd like to say thank you very much for the presentation, first of all. It's very thought-provoking. I was wondering, I know there's been a sort of evolution, I think, even in your own thinking about how to total the reparations. One way might be sort of thinking about reparations for the labor that was, for labor that was not paid to enslaved peoples, or the 24 hours of the day in which they were, had to work on these, plantations and other things like this. But now, I think it's quite brilliant. But I'm wondering why you've chosen to sort of concentrate on the 40 acres rather than some of these other ways, and some of the other, I think, amounts might be even larger. So I'm just interested in why you might be thinking that way. And I actually have a sort of follow-up question, because New Zealand has used sort of the Treaty of Waitangi, I think it's what it's called, as a sort of treaty that was
Maori.
the Maori peoples back in 1840 as a way for Maori tribes to get redress from sort of legal legislation that was never sort of enacted. So I was just wondering if you had the sort of same sort of thought in choosing this particular form of reparations. Thank you.
Thank you. So there are a couple of things to kind of unpackage. We start with the 40 acres because this was the land that the federal government promised to the newly emancipated Black people. This is land that they could have, grown crops on, built homes on. It would have given them, access to, basically to citizenship rights, especially if their rights to that property were protected. If the Union soldiers had been, had been allowed to stay in the South and protect them so that they would not have been subject to round after round after round of white mob violence. But they didn't get those 40 acres, right? But at the same time, beginning in 1862, the federal government passed the Homestead Act. And the Homestead Act allocated 160-acre land grants to white Americans, including recent immigrants from Europe. They did get that land, okay? 1.5 million white households received those 160-acre land grants. So this is land that you could live on, you could subdivide it, you could lease it. Any lumber, any minerals, any livestock was yours to keep or to sell. And this is precisely what people did. But most importantly, the profits from that land and the land itself could be passed on to your offspring. And this is what happened. So you've got now, today, in some cases, 6, 7 generations of white families that were in possession of this land that was a consequence of a single federal policy, right? One of our colleagues, Jennifer Mueller, has done a tremendous amount of research on the Homestead Act. And she has had her students to look at their own family's wealth positions. And in one case, a family in Texas, they got a land grant in the Texas Panhandle. So one of the conditions of the land grant policy was A, the land was tax-free. B, you only had to live on it for 5 years and then make your claim and it was yours to have. Or you could decide, I'm going to sell this land, you paid a small fee, almost never more than about $15 for those 160 acres of land. So back to Jennifer Mueller's class. So the student talked to their grandparents and grandparents and discovered that in 1880, their family had received a land grant in the Panhandle of Texas. Right. So they decided they would lease this land instead of living on it. So they're receiving an income stream from this basically free equity, a handout from the federal government. Then the patriarch dies and his widow and her 8 children decide that they will move to Austin, Texas to give the children a better chance of getting a college education. 6 of the 8 graduate with a college degree, debt-free, because they have the money to pay for that education. Then the matriarch dies, and the 8 children decide they will continue to lease the land. So they're still receiving an income stream. Then in 1980, a full 100 years later, natural gas is discovered on their land. It turns out to be the largest such deposit in the area. So much so that the revenue from the first year alone was over $100,000. So it's like, you're getting a dividend check every month from the federal government. This is what white Americans have that Black Americans do not. But we know that racism, it's a very powerful indicator. But we know that, white supremacy is like, you've got this sort of cumulative intergenerational effect of wealth that white people are allowed to have because of white supremacy, and Black people are denied. So that's why we talk about the 40 acres, because this is when the federal government had a choice. The federal government already was out of balance, only 40 acres for Black people and 160 for whites, but still, We may not be having this conversation if Black Americans had gotten those 40-acre land grants. So that's what we're talking about, the sort of cumulative effects of these government policies that have advantaged white Americans. The government is investing in white wealth accumulation and disinvesting in Black wealth accumulation.
I think there are two related points that might be pertinent to what you were asking. So the first is that our focus on identifying the amount that is due is not exclusively on the lost wealth associated with the denial of the 40 acres. We actually look at the contemporary racial wealth gap, which we view as the cumulative intergenerational effect of multiple policies, inclusive of the denial of the 40 acres. And so, so it's not just the 40 acres alone that determines what we have in mind here. And so that wealth gap of approximately $840,000 per household, or if you were to try to calculate this on the basis of an individual who would be an eligible recipient, it's about $350,000. That's what amounts to the $14 trillion figure when you multiply that by 40 million Black Americans who are living today who presumably have somebody who was an ancestor enslaved in the United States. Now, you mentioned another strategy for trying to calculate this. It's a strategy that's present in an article that Thomas Kramer was the lead author on, a political scientist who's in the policy program at the University of Connecticut. And I'm actually the rump author on that particular article. But a lot of people who have championed the number that we generated in that article don't realize that I was one of the participants on the project. And so when I say that that's a number that is unrealistic, folks they say, well, that's not what Thomas Kramer said. But it's not what Thomas Kramer and Sandy Darity and 5 other co-authors said. But that's an estimate that's based on the amount of time that was stolen by slaveholders. So, the argument is, if you're thinking about what was taken from the enslaved, you have to treat the full 24 hours of every day as something that was taken from them. And if you use an interest rate for compounding of 6%, which is one that you could justify, you get this enormous sum. You get a sum of $6.2 quadrillion, which is larger than the total amount of wealth globally in the world today. And so that's one that I would argue is infeasible to meet. But there's another reason why that's not an appropriate number, and that is because the amount that should go to living descendants who have suffered the cumulative consequences of these historical atrocities is not the amount that should have been paid directly to the individuals who suffered from enslavement themselves. And so I think there is some validity to the argument that people make when they say, well, should we pay people today what was owed to their ancestors as a consequence of the direct horrors that their ancestors experienced? And I would say no. But what we should be paying living descendants are the consequences and harms that they face as a result of what has happened historically. Yeah. Thank you for that question. Yeah.
Hi, thank you both for coming and taking the time to talk with us today. I have a question. So you mentioned that there's this upward trend from 4% to 15% of white people willing to pay endorsement to Black people. Can you explain more on how this seemingly individual endorsement is defined, and how is this data collected?
It's actually, well, I don't know if you were specific that the numbers were about white Americans and not all Americans.
Yes, white Americans.
Yeah, so it's a figure that goes from 4% in the year 2000 to 30% in the present moment. And it's based upon a question that people were asked about whether or not they were in favor of monetary payments to Black Americans for reparations. So the phrase monetary payments is in the question each time it's asked.
So how the question is phrased matters too. But yes, so there were actually 3 polls. And so the first was 4, and the second was 16, and the third is 30. Now, interestingly, during that first poll, they also asked if Japanese Americans should receive reparations. And the majority of white people said no, when in fact they had already received them, which tells you a lot about, our education system.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for this. In your presentation, you talked about how this is a national rather than a personal or individual institutional responsibility. But I'm wondering about what kinds of institutional responsibilities remain, especially for an institution like the University of the South, and the way in which action by the University of the South may be beneficial not only to individuals harmed by this institution, but also to the larger arc of reparations work. And I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to that responsibility, or what you think of that responsibility at the smaller institution, even though by no means am I suggesting that that's where that responsibility ends.
So we like to kind of think of it as kind of a both and proposition, right? There certainly are, there's a panoply of things that individual institutions could do to improve relations with folks who they have harmed in the past. And we would salute you for that. But we would also ask that you use your might to also lobby and petition Congress. This idea of forming a coalition of other colleges and universities is tremendous. When we first started doing this work, we naively thought that colleges and universities would be on the vanguard. It was a no-brainer to us, but that's not at all what happened. And we thought that for a couple of reasons. First of all, because we value colleges and universities and what they stand for and what they can do, but also because of the harms that colleges and universities have done to Black people. Both teaching that Black people are cognitively inferior and justifying slavery. So we thought, well, maybe, they will say, well, it's time for us to acknowledge the role that we played. And maybe the best thing that we can do is to say, from here on out, we have a different message. And the message is that we're going to lobby and petition Congress. We're going to use our muscle. We're going to stand up and be on the mic and talk about this. So I think that would be really, really important. Don't neglect the things that you need to do locally. Certainly not. I wouldn't want you to do that. But I would also want to see that same kind of energy, that same kind of fervor, that same kind of anger, that same kind of determination that you have to right the wrongs of the place that you have made your stand, but also to fight for this national program of reparations.
And I just would add that the local actions are of deep value, but they should not be viewed as reparations per se. That's the key thing. And similarly, we don't think that states and localities that adopt programs to try to improve conditions there are adopting something that should be called reparations. So it would be fine with us if Evanston, Illinois said that they had put in place a housing voucher program. But for them to call it an act of reparative justice is actually a bit extreme. You know, one of the points that we like to make is that if the bill is $14 trillion, the states and localities cannot do it. Their total combined budgets are about $3.1 trillion. So it's just infeasible for them to meet a bill that would be adequate there. But, you know, if we're thinking about the University of the South, there's so many things that would merit historical repair. You know, one of the things that we were trying to determine is whether or not any of the young people out of the St. Mark's community had ever attended the University of the South. And to the best of what we could learn in 2 days is that that's never been the case. So, you know, a very simple step might be to try to recruit students from that community to attend the university. But that would not be reparations,
Right.
but it would be an act of atonement.
I mean, Durham, North Carolina, where we live, almost 3 years ago now, the mayor created a racial equity task force, and they identified about 18 different areas that the city needed to focus on. And it's not as if once they produce their recommendations, magically all of those things are in play, but we at least have a blueprint now that the city can use. And importantly, they call it Racial Equity Initiative. Also, the Durham, North Carolina City Council unanimously passed a resolution in support of a national reparations program. And it specifies the key, the key components for such an initiative, which are that you talk about who the eligible, who's eligible for reparations. And for us, as we said, it's individuals who can meet two standards, a lineage standard and an identity standard, folks who can trace their lineage to at least one person who was enslaved in the United States and who self-identified as Black, African-American, Afro-American, or Negro for 12 years prior to the creation of a reparations program or commission. That this legislation would identify the elimination of the racial wealth gap as one of its primary goals, that it would make direct payments to the eligible recipients as opposed to giving the money to some third party to manage, or giving the money to a scholarship fund, or giving the money to XYZ initiative. And then fourthly, the Durham City Council resolution specifies that the federal government is the culpable party and should pay that bill. Sewanee could pass such a resolution and do a number of other things to support this effort.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for this presentation, and it's been really informational. There's like 4 different questions that I would like to ask you, but in the interest of time, I'm just going to ask you. So you have established that $14 trillion are necessary in order to like completely eliminate the Black-white.
Will you pull your mask down just a little bit?
Oh,
okay, thank you.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yes, thank
So
you.
you've established that $14 trillion are necessary in order to eliminate the Black and white wealth inequality. So what I'm assuming with this is that once reparations are made, every African-American citizen that receives reparation would receive the same amount. So
Right.
That being said, how would that affect would that have any effect on racial relationships, given the fact that white wealth inequality would still be existing?
Yeah, well, that is a consideration.
Right.
The Black-white wealth gap has existed for 156 years. And the white median wealth has been above Black median wealth for 156 years. If you were to eliminate the Black-white wealth gap by making equal payments to all Black Americans who are eligible, you would create a situation in which the Black median wealth level is above the white median wealth level, even though the averages would be the same. And if that's a concern, then I would ask whether or not it would be appropriate for that differential to exist for another 156 years.
All right, I would like to thank Dr. William Darity and Mrs. Kirsten Mullen for joining us here tonight. I would also like to thank sponsors and supporters of the Roberson Project. And I would like to remind everyone about the town hall tomorrow at 2 p.m. in Convocation Hall. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you.